She was standing in the parking garage in the rain with a dead phone and a broken heel, and I almost kept driving. I want to be honest about that. I sat at the exit barrier with my window rolled up and my headlights on her for a full 4 seconds before I hit the button and let the window down. 4 seconds is long enough to make a decision. Long enough to know exactly what kind of decision you're making. Long enough to feel the weight of it and choose anyway. "I can drop you somewhere," I said. Not warmly, not as an invitation, just as a fact being placed on a table. Diane Collier looked at me the way she looked at everything I said in meetings, like she was doing a rapid assessment of whether engaging was worth the energy it would cost her. It was a look I had cataloged over 3 years of sitting across from her in conference rooms and watching her deploy it on colleagues, clients, and on me specifically with a frequency that had never stopped being slightly aggravating. She did it for about 2 seconds. Then the rain picked up. Not harder, just insistent, the kind that makes a point, and she walked around the front of my car to the passenger door and got in without another word. That was how it started. Diane and I had shared a department for 3 years. Shared is the generous word for it. We occupied the same floor of the same building, reported to the same director, competed for the same accounts, attended the same Monday morning stand-ups where we sat on opposite sides of the table and presented our separate updates in turns, and had across all of that time developed a specific professional courtesy that was functionally indistinguishable from mutual tolerance, if you didn't know. Either of us well enough to see where the edges were. The edges were always there. We were both good at the job. The department was not built for 2 people who were equally good at the same job, and we had each understood that fact from approximately the 3rd week, without either of us ever saying it directly. Because saying it directly would have required an honesty that neither of us was prepared to spend on the other. Her name was Diane Collier, and she had come to the company from a competing firm where she had, by the account of everyone who had worked with her there, been genuinely excellent. She was methodical in a way that sometimes read as cold, until you understood that the method was not a substitute for instinct. It was the structure she built around instinct, so it couldn't run loose and cost her something. She prepared more than anyone else in the department, which I knew because I prepared more than anyone else in the department, and she still had things at meetings that I didn't have. She asked questions in client calls that reframed the whole conversation without making the client feel reframed, which is a skill that takes years to develop and looks effortless once you have it. And she had, in 3 years of working on the same floor, gotten 3 accounts that I believed I had worked harder for. I had gotten 2 that I believed she had worked harder for. That is the honest accounting. I have had time to do it properly. There is a particular quality to competing with someone who is genuinely good. It is different from competing with someone who is ambitious but limited, or someone whose advantage is mainly political. With someone genuinely good, the losses land differently. You cannot attribute them to luck or to favoritism or to a client who simply didn't know what they were looking at. You have to look at the loss directly. You have to find where your work was insufficient and hers was not. And then you have to sit with that fact and do something with it, which is uncomfortable in a way that losers to lesser opponents are not. I did not enjoy this process. I am reasonably certain she did not enjoy it either on the occasions when it went the other direction. But what it produced, the level of preparation, the depth of client research, the precision of the pitches we each built individually, was better work than either of us would have produced without the other as the standard. This is something I understood intellectually during those 3 years. I did not know what to do with it in any practical sense, because knowing that a rival is raising your game does not change the fact that they are still the rival. You can appreciate the competitive pressure in the abstract while still sitting across from the same person in a Monday morning meeting and calculating whether the account they just mentioned represents a threat to your Q3 numbers. Both things were true simultaneously for 3 years. The mind is very good at holding contradictions when the contradictions are professionally convenient. The other thing I knew about Diane Collier, which I had never said out loud and barely admitted to myself, was that she was the most interesting person on the floor. Not interesting the way people describe someone they like in a context where they're not supposed to admit they like them. Though I suppose that complicates things in retrospect. Interesting in the specific sense that she had a way of being wrong that was more instructive than most people's being right. When she assessed a situation incorrectly, which happened, she was not infallible. Nobody with 3 years of data points is infallible. The error was always precise. She had gotten one variable wrong, or weighted 2 variables in the wrong ratio, and the rest of the architecture was sound. Which meant watching her reassess was watching a disciplined mind retrace its steps, identify the exact fault line, and correct from there. It was the professional equivalent of watching someone solve the same problem twice. I had learned more from her being wrong than from several of my colleagues being right, and I had never told her or anyone else this, because it was not the kind of thing you told someone you were competing with. I have since told her. She said she already knew, because she had been watching me do the same thing with her work. This was mildly irritating, and also exactly in character. The Harmon account was currently sitting in a shared drive folder with both our names on a preliminary pitch deck, which was the professional equivalent of a controlled detonation that hadn't gone off yet. Our director had assigned us jointly to it 6 weeks earlier in a meeting where his phrasing, "I want both of your minds on this one," full collaboration. The client is too important for anything less, had been so carefully diplomatic that it had functioned as a warning rather than an instruction. What it actually meant was, this account is large enough that losing it over the 2 of you refusing to work together would be a problem I would have to escalate, so please do not make me do that. We had heard him correctly. We had held exactly 2 working meetings on the Harmon deck since then, both of which had ended with the deck in approximately the same state it had started, and both of us leaving the conference room in opposite directions, which at least meant we weren't in the elevator together. The presentation was in 11 days. I need to explain what the Harmon account actually was, because otherwise the weight of it doesn't land correctly. Harmon Group was a mid-sized infrastructure holding company that had been circling our firm for the better part of a year. They were not the largest account we had pitched that quarter. They were not the most lucrative in absolute dollar terms, though the contract value was significant enough to matter. What made Harmon important was what they represented in terms of sector positioning. They were the kind of client that, once named in your portfolio, opened conversations with 4 other clients in the same space who had been watching to see who Harmon trusted before committing themselves. Winning Harmon was not winning one account. It was the door to a sector we had not meaningfully penetrated, which our director knew, and which Diane and I both knew, and which had been the unspoken pressure behind every meeting since the assignment. Losing it to an internal failure of collaboration would not just be losing the account. It would be the kind of loss that gets remembered. That becomes the reference point in future conversations about what went wrong in a given year. The kind that follows you. I had been lying awake about it for approximately 4 of the 6 weeks since the assignment. I had no reason to believe Diane had been sleeping any better. She had looked, in the second meeting, like someone who was performing patience with a precision that indicated it was costing her something, which I recognized because I had been performing the same thing from my side of the table. We were both good enough at the job to understand that the deck we had was insufficient. We were both too entrenched in the working against model to agree on what the sufficient version looked like. It was the professional equivalent of 2 people trying to open a door by each pulling their own side of the same handle, all the energy in the world, None of the result. That was the state of things when her heel broke in the parking garage and the rain came on, and I sat at the exit barrier with the window up. This was the context in which Diane Collier was now sitting in the passenger seat of my car with a broken heel in her hand and neither of us speaking. She gave me her address. I typed it into the GPS. The estimated time was 22 minutes. I did the quiet calculation of 22 minutes of this specific silence and found the number uncomfortable. She broke it first. I had not expected her to. "The Section 3 transition is wrong," she said. She said it the way you say something you have been sitting on for a while, not like an accusation, like a release of pressure. I kept my eyes on the road. "I know." A pause. "You know." "I've known for a week," I said. "I've been trying to figure out how to fix it without having to restructure the whole back half, which is what fixing it properly would require, and I haven't found a way to do it yet." She was quiet for a moment. The rain was consistent against the windshield. The GPS told me to stay on the current road for 12 minutes. "I have a version," she said. I said nothing. "I've had it for 5 days," she said. "I didn't send it. Why not?" "Because the last time I sent a unilateral revision to something we were both working on, you didn't speak to me for 3 days, and the version you submitted to the director after that incorporated exactly none of what I'd changed." I felt the specific discomfort of being accurately described. "You removed the client data I'd spent 2 weeks pulling together. It was redundant. It was sourced. It was documentation. It slowed the read by 40 seconds, and the clients never look at it anyway," she said. "The deck is a door. You get them in the door, and then you answer their questions. Nobody reads an appendix in a first pitch. Then it should have been an appendix." "You're right," she said. "That's what I should have changed it to instead of cutting it. That was my error." I waited for the rest of the point. There was no rest. She had said it was her error and moved on, the way you do when you're not interested in the apology being the main event. "The Section 3 version," I said. "What did you do with it?" She reached into the bag she was holding against her jacket. She'd been clutching it since she got in, the way you hold something close when you don't know what the situation is going to require, and pulled out a notebook. Not a phone. Not a tablet. A notebook, the medium-sized kind with a cloth cover, filled from what I could see with handwriting that ran in organized lines down the left side of each page, with structured annotations branching off to the right. She opened it to a page near the middle and held it out at an angle so I could glance at it from the driver's seat. "Eyes on the road," she said. "I'm glancing." Glance at the road. I glanced at the road and then back. I could see enough of the structure of it to understand she had reworked the entire middle section from the transition point forward, not as a patch, but as an actual reconstruction, with a different logical spine. It was going to require me to look at it properly. "Talk me through it," I said. And she did, for the next 9 minutes, without performing it, without framing it for my approval, without watching my face for the reaction she wanted. She just laid it out. The logic of the restructure, the reason the current transition failed, what the client's actual decision sequence looked like from the inside, and how the current Section 3 was answering a question the client hadn't asked yet, while leaving the question they had asked unanswered until Section 5, which was 2 sections too late. She talked through it the way I had heard her talk through problems when she didn't know I was listening, in the hallway, on phone calls with her own clients, in the kitchen once when she was working through something out loud and hadn't noticed me come in. She thought in full sentences. The logic was clean and the structure beneath it was cleaner, and every time I had a question forming, she answered it in the next sentence, which was either very good preparation or the particular fluency of someone who had been working through the same problem for 5 days and was finally talking to someone who understood the material. It was good. It was better than what I had. I understood that within 4 minutes and spent the remaining 5 minutes listening carefully enough to understand exactly how much better it was and in which specific ways. We arrived at her street. I parked. She closed the notebook. The rain had softened. A light was on in the building across from hers, a square of warm yellow in an otherwise dark facade. That fixes Section 3, I said. Yes, it also means the client data issue from Section 4 needs to move, because the logical flow you've built assumes the audience already understands the risk profile before Section 4 opens. And they won't, not with the current sequencing. She looked at me. Where would you move it? Earlier, between the current Sections 2 and 3. Brief. 3 slides, not 7. The 7 is where it slows down. 3 slides, she said. Then that works. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside, a car passed. The rain tapped at the windows. Why did you stop? She asked. I knew she didn't mean the car. It was raining, I said. Marcus, I exhaled. Looked at the steering wheel, then at her. Because driving past felt like something I'd be thinking about later. I didn't want it on my list. Your list of what? Things I did when I had the option not to. She was quiet in a way that was not the professional courtesy quiet. It was a different kind. Then she said, I've been working against you for 3 years. She said it flat, the way you say a fact that doesn't need decoration. Not out of dislike. I want to be clear about that. It was strategy. You were the person most likely to take the account I wanted, so I treated you as the obstacle between me and the account. That was the operating model. I know, I said. You know. I've been running the same model, I said. You were the obstacle. Not a person who also wanted the account. The obstacle. The word sat in the car between us for a moment. It was not a comfortable word when you said it out loud about a person sitting next to you. The Harmon deck, she said. Yes, if we actually did this right, she said. Not assigned together right. Actually right. Both of us, actually trying, full access to everything we each have on this client, we'd win it. I know that. You've known that. Since the second meeting, I said, when I watched you with the client brief and you caught the thing about their secondary market exposure that I had seen and decided wasn't central. It's central. You were right. If we were actually working together, I would have told you that in the meeting. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Come up. I'll make coffee and we can do the whole deck tonight. Everything, start from the first slide and build it properly. I understood what I was agreeing to. Not in terms of coffee or the deck, though both were real and both mattered. I understood that saying yes was choosing a different shape for the next however many months than the shape I had been operating inside. It would require me to trust someone I had very consciously decided not to trust. It would require being wrong in front of her. It would require putting my best thinking on the table, without the protective layer of framing it as preliminary, of leaving exits, of hedging, so that if she found the flaw I could say I hadn't committed to it yet. I would have to actually show her the working version of how I thought, which is the most exposed thing a person in our kind of work can do with a competitor. Because then they know not just what you know, but how you think. And that is leverage of a different and more durable kind. I turned the car off. Her apartment was on the 4th floor, the kind of space that looked like it had been organized once at the beginning and maintained through discipline since then. Books on a shelf in a system I didn't immediately understand, but could tell was a system, not alphabetical, not by color. Something else, something that reflected the way she actually used them, rather than the way they were supposed to look. A desk near the window with a second monitor and a lamp positioned at a specific angle. The kind of angle that tells you the person who positioned it thought about glare. Post-it notes on the edge of the second monitor in 4 different colors, organized in columns. I did not read them, but I noted the system. A jacket on the back of the desk chair that she took off when she came in and hung properly, not as a performance of tidiness, but as a habit, which is the version that actually means something. No clutter on the kitchen table, which is where she made coffee. A French press, not a machine, which told me she was not interested in convenience for its own sake. She was interested in the result, and set the notebook open between us with the same practicality with which she had done everything since the parking garage, which is to say, without ceremony, without performance, with the clean directness of someone who had already decided the next 3 hours were going to produce something, and was not going to waste the first 20 minutes of them on setup. We started at slide 1. She pulled up the deck on her laptop and rotated it so we could both see, and I opened the version on my phone as a secondary reference, and we looked at slide 1 together in silence for a moment. Slide 1 was fine. Slide 1 had always been fine. The problem was never slide 1. "Skip to 3, I said. She skipped to 3. We looked at it. It was as wrong as it had been for 6 weeks, except that now, having heard her notebook version in the car, I could see exactly where the wrongness began, the 3rd bullet, where the logical sequence assumed the client had already accepted a premise that the deck had not yet established. 3 weeks ago I had looked at that bullet and felt that something was off without being able to locate it. Now I could locate it to the word. "There," I said, and pointed. "Yes," she said. "That's where it falls apart." This is what I had not understood about working with Diane Collier from inside the opponent model she edited without ego. I had assumed, because of how she fought for her positions in meetings, that she would fight for them the same way in a working session. She didn't. She held positions that were correct and released positions the moment a better option appeared, without a lag, without a visible transition from defense to acceptance. She didn't need the beat of concession that most people need, the moment where they register that they've yielded and you register that you've won. She just moved forward. It made the work faster by a factor I would have found implausible if I hadn't been watching it happen in real time. I had also not understood how much of what read as coldness in meetings was simply economy. She did not spend words managing the emotional temperature of a conversation when the conversation was about work. She kept the temperature at a functional level, enough warmth to maintain the working relationship, not 1 degree more than necessary, because the extra degree cost time, and she had decided the time was better spent on the actual problem. Once I understood this, the working session changed quality entirely. I stopped parsing her tone for signals and started listening to the content of what she said, which was almost uniformly useful. This is, I suspect, what she had been doing with me for 6 weeks and finding frustrating, and I cannot fault her for the frustration. She argued with me 4 times across the first 2 hours. I was right twice and wrong twice. Both times I was wrong, she took the point cleanly and moved on. Both times she was wrong, she said, "You're right," before I finished making the case and adjusted the slide. There was no scorekeeping. Or there was scorekeeping, because there always is between 2 competitive people, but it was pointed entirely at the deck and not at each other. At 10:30 she got up and refilled the French press without asking if I wanted more, which I did, and when she came back she brought it, and 2 clean mugs, and poured without ceremony, which is how you treat someone when you have stopped thinking about what impression you're making on them and started just working with them. I noticed it the way you notice when a sound stops, by the quality of what replaced it. The Section 3 fix, built on her restructure and my repositioning of the data slides, took 40 minutes and came out better than either of us had drafted independently. I could see it as we built it. The way the logic now moved in the direction the client's own thinking moved. The way the risk material arrived exactly when the client would be asking the question it answered. The way the final slide of Section 3 now set up Section 4, the way a good sentence sets up the next one. It was the right deck, not a compromise between two versions. A third thing that neither version had been. At 11:15, she found a sequencing error I had introduced when we rebuilt the transition. Not a small error, the kind that would have been visible in a live presentation, and she flagged it without emphasis. Just this is out of order now, and pointed to the slide, and I looked at it and felt the specific internal sensation of having been caught doing something sloppy that I had been sloppy. Enough not to catch myself. I fixed it. She moved on. Nothing more was said about it. This is a thing I remembered later. At midnight, I found a factual error in a market comparison slide that had been in the deck since the original brief. Not something either of us had introduced. A number that had been sourced from an outdated report that the director's assistant had pulled together at the start of the project. The number was wrong by enough to matter if a client checked it, which a client with their own research team almost certainly would. I flagged it. Diane went to her second monitor and pulled the correct source in 4 minutes. The correction took another 3. We updated the speaker notes with the sourcing. This is what competence looks like when it is not performing for an audience. It just fixes things. At 12:45, she looked at the deck, the full thing start to finish, with all the revisions integrated and the flow now reading clean, and said, "That's the one." I looked at it. "Yes, we should do a run-through. Tonight?" "You know you won't sleep anyway," she said. She was correct. I do not sleep well the night before I find a significant error in something I've been working on. And I had found a significant error 12 minutes earlier in something I had been working on for 6 weeks, which meant I was going to be awake until at least 2 thinking about it regardless of what I did. I said, "Okay." We ran through it once. She took the first half. I took the second. And then we switched, and she took the second, and I took the first, because the way you find your weak spots in a presentation is to give the part you didn't write. There were 4 places in my run-through where she said pause there, and I paused. And she said, "The client is going to ask you what the timeline is on that number, or they're going to want to know if you've spoken to their legal team about this," and she was right each time. I made notes. She had already made hers. At 1:40 we finished. The deck was, without qualification, the best pitch I had been part of building in 3 years at that company. It had her architecture and my data, her client read and my documentation, her editing pace and my structural instincts, and the result of that combination was something that had none of the compromised middle quality that collaborative work usually produces. It was not the midpoint between 2 versions. It was past both of them. "That's it," I said. "That's it," she said. I said I should go. She pointed out it was nearly 2 in the morning and the rain had come back and she had a guest room, and it was not a complicated offer. I said I was fine to drive. She said she had not asked if I was fine to drive. She had stated that it was nearly 2 in the morning and that there was a guest room, and that the offer was logistical in nature and not required to mean anything beyond logistics. The logic was exact, and the framing left no room for misinterpretation in either direction. I stayed. The guest room had a window that faced the street, and a lamp on a timer that clicked off at 2. I lay in the dark for a while, thinking about the deck, and then not thinking about it, because there was nothing left to think. It was done. It was right. We had done it, and it was the right one. And then I fell asleep. In the morning, coffee was made when I came downstairs. She was at the kitchen table, reading something on her tablet, and she looked up and said, "There are eggs, if you want them," in the tone of someone who had said this before, which she had not, but who had never been interested in making things more complicated than they were, which was consistent with everything I had learned about her across the previous 11 hours. I made eggs. She kept reading. We didn't reconstruct the night before over breakfast or name what had changed or discuss what the shape of things was now. We didn't need to. The morning had a quality of something already settled, which is different from unresolved. Resolved things feel finished. Settled things feel like ground you're standing on. I left at 7:15. My shoes were at her door. I had left them at the entrance the night before, out of a habit I have from years of visiting my mother, who has floors she cares about, and I had forgotten them and picked them up on the way out. It was the smallest, most ordinary thing, shoes at a door, the expected result of having left them there, and I stood on her step for a moment holding them, with the morning quiet and the street still damp from the previous night, and I thought about 3 years of energy organized around the wrong question. Not how do we both do good work, but how do I do better work than her? Which is a different question, with a smaller answer and a ceiling built into it from the start. And I thought about what 11 hours of the right question had produced, which was sitting in a shared drive folder and was going to win an account that neither of us would have won alone, and I thought about the 4 seconds in the parking garage with my headlights on her and the window still up and the decision sitting right there, and how close I had come to driving past it. I put my shoes on. I went to work. The Harmon presentation was 10 days later, on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, in a conference room on the 23rd floor of the client's building. We had done 2 more run-throughs in the intervening days. One at the office in an empty conference room at 7 in the morning. Once over a call the night before, where we each took the half we hadn't written and tested our fluency with material that wasn't ours. Both times she caught places where I was imprecise. Both times I caught places where she was moving through a section too quickly for an audience that hadn't lived inside the material for 6 weeks. We made adjustments both times. By the morning of the presentation, the deck was not a thing we were hoping would work. It was a thing we had already stress-tested to the point where we understood its weight distribution, where it was strong enough to hold anything the room could put on it, and where the load-bearing points were, and how to redirect pressure away from those points, if needed. There were 7 people on their side of the table when we walked in. I clocked them in the first 30 seconds. This is a habit I have had since my first major pitch, and it has saved me more times than I can count. The man at the head of the table was not the decision-maker. He was the room's designated warmth, the one whose job is to make the presenting team comfortable, and comfort is not what the presenting team needs. The woman to his left, who had not smiled when we came in, was the one whose approval mattered. The second person on the left, the one with a legal pad already half full when we sat down, that was the risk officer. I had been in enough of these rooms to know that a half-full legal pad before the presentation begins means the person is already working, is already processing, has already formed preliminary assessments, and is here to test them against what we bring. The risk officer would be the hardest question in the room, which also meant she was the most important person to answer correctly. Diane took the first half. I sat beside her and watched the room while she presented, not the reactions to her specifically, but the tells that would tell me what was coming. The man at the head of the table nodded in the places designed to produce nodding, which was useful information about his function and not much else. The woman to his left was still. Not disengaged still, attentive still. The stillness of someone holding everything back until they have enough data to draw from. When Diane hit the Section 3 turn, the logical shift we had rebuilt from the ground up in the kitchen, I watched that woman's pen move for the first time. She wrote something down. When a decision-maker writes something down in the first half of a pitch, it means the argument has made contact. It means something landed. I took the second half. I could feel the room differently from the presenting position than from the observer position. More exposed, more granular in its feedback. The energy when I opened the data section was different from any pitch I had given with the original deck, because the data now arrived in the exact sequence the room's thinking had been prepared for. The way a well-constructed sentence arrives at its final word in the place where the reader already needed it. The risk officer's pen had been moving since Section 4 opened. That was already better than any prior version of this pitch had produced. The question came at the end of Section 4, 30 seconds before I hit the final slide. The risk officer looked up from her legal pad and asked about the timeline on one of the market comparison numbers, specifically whether the figure reflected the current regulatory landscape or the pre-amendment version. It was a precise and expert question, and it was the exact question Diane had said she would ask, sitting at a kitchen table at midnight 9 days before, with the corrected source pulled up on a second monitor. I had the answer on the next slide, sourced and annotated, with the effective date of the regulatory amendment in the speaker notes where I could reference it without looking like I was reading. I answered it. The risk officer wrote something down and then looked up and held eye contact for an extra second, which is the version of approval that people who do not perform approval will give you if you earn it. The questions ran for another 40 minutes after the formal presentation ended. Long questions, detailed questions, questions that assumed a follow-up meeting already existed and were beginning to populate its agenda. When the room has decided and is now planning the relationship rather than evaluating the pitch, the questions change character. These had changed. I knew it halfway through. I watched Diane field a question about long-term scope, and she answered it without hedging, confident, specific, with the name of a colleague who would handle the component in question. Because she knew too. We were not performing for an undecided room. We were beginning a working relationship with a client who had already decided. The remaining 40 minutes were the first 40 minutes of something else. We walked out onto the sidewalk 45 minutes later. Diane was quiet in the elevator and quiet through the lobby, and then on the sidewalk in the thin October light she said, "Good," which is the word she uses when something has gone exactly as it should and she is not interested in performing the celebration. "Good," I said back. She looked at me. "Same time next quarter?" I thought about the parking garage, the 4 seconds, the exit barrier. The way she had assessed the situation and gotten in the car and handed me 9 minutes of the best deck analysis I had been given by anyone in 3 years, delivered in a moving vehicle in the rain, because she had been working on it for 5 days and needed to say it out loud to someone who understood the material. "Let's not wait for the rain this time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the professional courtesy version, not the one deployed for meetings in hallways and directors, but the real kind. The kind that involves the eyes and means something has changed. And she knows exactly what. She flagged a cab. She got in. She was gone. I stood on the sidewalk for a little while. There is a specific weight that lifts when you stop treating someone as a problem. I do not know how to describe it except to say that 3 years of it coming off at once is perceptible as a physical thing. Like putting down something you had been carrying so long you had stopped being aware of its weight, and then being surprised by how light your hands feel. She is still the most formidable person I work with. That has not changed. She is still meticulous and prepared and correct more often than anyone I work beside. And she still takes positions with a confidence that used to read to me as arrogance, and now reads as the earned fluency of someone who does the work before she opens her mouth. What changed is that none of that is a problem. What changed is that I stopped needing it to be. The Harmon account was announced internally the following week. Both our names were on it. We held a debrief meeting with the director, just the 3 of us, and he said, "This is exactly what I was hoping for. in the tone of someone who had not been entirely sure it was possible. Diane and I exchanged a look across the table that lasted about half a second and contained everything I have described in the previous several thousand words. The director did not notice. He was already looking at the next quarter's pipeline. After the meeting, in the hallway, she said, "The Belmore account goes to brief in February." I said, "I saw that." She said, "I have some preliminary thinking." I said, "So do I." She said, "Coffee?" I said, "The French press or the machine?" She said, "The French press is not optional." We walked down the hall. The floor was the same floor it had always been. The building was the same building. The Monday morning stand-ups would still happen, and we would still sit at the same table. None of the externals had changed. And yet everything I have just described had happened in the space of one evening. One rainy parking garage, 4 seconds at an exit barrier, and the particular weight of a question I was not willing to have on my list. The shoes were still at her door when I picked them up. Mine, as I said, entirely ordinary. But I have thought about them more than anything else in this story, because the shoes were the proof that I had actually been there, that I had walked through the door, taken off my shoes the way you do when you're in someone's space and you intend to stay for a while, done the work, and left in the morning with the work done. The proof that 4 seconds had been enough to choose differently. That differently had been worth choosing. Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision that looked like nothing? 4 seconds, a window button, a car that could have kept moving, and realized later that those 4 seconds were the ones that changed the shape of everything that came after? And is there someone in your life right now that you've been treating as an obstacle, exhausting yourself working against, when the truth you haven't let yourself say out loud is that you've been competing with exactly the person you should have been building with all along? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe. You know where to find the next one.